Hey y'all, Scott here, and dimensions, am I right? I've decided to create a term to describe that dimension fever we all have from time to time. Dementia. Urban Dictionary doesn't know what's about to hit it. 2D, two dimensions that were at their peak in the early 90s. The Nintendo Entertainment System initiated a boom in game development at the time. Company after company threw their hat in the ring, putting out their own games, and when things moved on to the 16-bit era with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, game development entered a bit of a renaissance. Developers were starting to perfect game controls, sprite work, and level designs. These systems were home to some of the greatest games of all time, games that felt like true evolutions from what we got on previous hardware. Rocket Knight Adventures, Super Castlevania 4, Mega Man X, Super Mario World, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Donkey Kong Country, games were not only getting better, but looking better as well. So, of course, the big question at the time was, what's next? A 3-for-1 combo deal in Dimensions, obviously. 3D was the next big thing, and everybody knew it. Some games gave off the illusion of moving in 3D space, stuff like F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, Pilot Wings, and whatnot. Some games look 3D, but were pre-rendered 2D sprites of 3D images, like with Donkey Kong Country and Sonic 3D Blast, basically meaning they created a 3D model, then took a picture of it and made 2D animations out of them. Definite steps in the right direction, but with the introduction of the PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64, we got the true vision of what the future of gaming was going to be. Jesus Christ. The transition from 2D to 3D is a process of physical changes through which a franchise's 2D roots mature into a 3D one capable of sexual reproduction. This is the Wikipedia article for puberty. 2D to 3D was tough for most series. Many would think it's as simple as taking the camera and just throwing it behind the character rather than to the side of them. While in theory, yes, that works, it's important to understand that 2D games and 3D games are incredibly different. Since 2D games have only one plane to deal with, it's much simpler to lay out things like obstacles and objectives. It's easier to fill out a 2D level with things for the player to do. Moving into a 3D space, you have so much more you can do. You can move in all directions, exploration is cranked up, infinite possibilities as to how you accomplish a task. But these things bring in a few problems that never existed in 2D games. It's much easier for 3D games to feel empty, and there's a lot more that goes into perfecting a 3D environment. More testing has to be done to ensure less bugs, more possibilities have to be questioned when programming, and some people just can't play 3D games, they're too complicated for them. Nowadays, developers understand what goes into 2D and 3D games much better, and both types have merit, can be loads of fun, and get equal representation in the gaming market nowadays. But back when 3D games were in their infancy, developers had to figure out how to take their 2D franchise and make it work in 3D while retaining enough aspects of its origins for fans to stick with them. Of course, the shining example everybody looks at for 2D to 3D has to be Mario. The original Super Mario Bros. Games were 2D platformers consisting of you getting to the end of dozens upon dozens of linear stages. Surely nobody's ever made or even thought about that statement before. It's surely going to be on my tombstone. When 3D came into the mix, the developers had to change up a ton with the Mario formula to remedy technical constraints and to correlate with jumping into the third dimension. Super Mario 64 had 15 worlds to explore, a far cry from Super Mario World, which contained over 90 levels. This is due to those 15 worlds having multiple objectives to do within them, rather than being one and dones like previous Mario stages. The developers discovered how much fun it is to run around and explore within a 3D space, and decided to focus on that aspect when designing Mario 64. It's obvious at first the developers thought about just a straight conversion of 2D Mario to 3D, as they stated they originally planned on the flagpole from the original Super Mario Bros. Being in 64 to represent the end of a stage. At the end of the day, they went with the more open-ended level design, as that was the most fun, plus it was obviously more resourceful and viable to design 15 large levels with multiple objectives rather than around 90 fully 3D stages. Super Mario 64 is definitely quite a bit different compared to the Mario games that preceded it, but it still feels like Mario. Probably because fundamentally when you get down to it, Mario's all about running around and jumping, and in that respect, Super Mario 64 did the series right in 3D. It sounded the part and looked the part, definitely. Mario 64 keeps things pretty generic in the Mario universe, more than likely to keep the longtime fans comfortable with the big transition. Along with that, they had to explain how the camera system worked by making it into a character. That's how foreign camera control was back then. It does have some flaws and things that don't hold up well nowadays, but Super Mario 64 was a revolution and inspired everybody in the transition of 2D to 3D. It wasn't the first 3D game by a long shot, but it might as well have been. In comparison to Mario, when transitioning the Legend of Zelda series into 3D, it was much more one-to-one. Not completely, but it's easier to compare 2D and 3D Zelda games. Justifiably so, since the main format of Zelda at the time was top-down adventure games involving puzzle solving and combat. It's a lot easier to imagine this in 3D rather than this. You just throw the camera down and behind the character and wham, 3D. Of course, certain things had to be added and changed. The miracle of Z targeting was thrown into the mix to help out with aiming, and also having Link automatically jump across obstacles. That was nice of them. 2D wasn't completely killed off with the introduction of 3D though. The Castlevania series experimented with both 2D and 3D entries in the late 90s. The PlayStation received Castlevania Symphony of the Night, an evolved and refined version of Castlevania, now with RPG elements and an interconnected world with upgrades allowing access to more of said world, which was akin to the Metroid series, initiating the term Metroidvania. Castlevania on Nintendo 64 is clumsy and sloppy. Sure, Symphony of the Night was different from the older titles, but these games aren't really what people wanted from a Castlevania game. They were empty, boring, and fell victim to being early 3D games in a franchise that was primarily 2D. And that wasn't the only series that Konami stumbled with in terms of the jump. Contra Legacy of War, going from the fast-paced action of Contra to this. What a turnoff. But at least Metal Gear got a good treatment, with the Metal Gear series being top-down. It translated pretty well into 3D with the introduction of Metal Gear Solid. Game series didn't necessarily have to make the jump to 3D instantly. Sega's legendary Golden Axe series of beat-em-up games hailing from the arcades and Sega Genesis quietly faded into obscurity after the third entry. They're monotonous button mashers nowadays, but they still have their charm. Of course, Sega decided it was better late than never to catapult the series into 3D on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 with Golden Axe Beast Rider and whoa, a mature reimagining of the classic. Beast Rider brings many new things into the series, such as bad. It's not good. It had the advantage of releasing well after 3D was well established, but this is just a poorly made, boring, repetitive hack and slash. Sega did a similar thing with Altered Beast, another arcade and Genesis classic beat-em-up, which finally made the transition into the fabled Third Dimension in a PlayStation 2 exclusive only released in Europe. On the other side of the quality spectrum, Tecmo brought Ninja Gaiden into 3D with a rebooted series premiering on Xbox, and these games are a fateful modern take on Ninja Gaiden in my opinion. Sure, they went from action platformers to more so hack and slashes, but they retained the difficulty the series was known for. Ninja Gaiden 3 was bad. You go from a Roman numeral 2 to standard 3, that's already a bad sign. Metroid took a hiatus after the critically acclaimed Super Metroid and didn't receive a 3D entry until the release of Metroid Prime on the GameCube, where the game shifted perspectives to first person, a move that initially was met with controversy and later praised hard. I'd say it was smart for these series to wait for a 3D jump, as it gave developers time to understand 3D game design. Of course, things like this still happen, but waiting can be beneficial. One series that's shockingly never made the full jump to 3D is Kirby. To me, it feels like the developers behind Kirby, HAL Laboratory, desperately want to make a 3D Kirby game, but some narc in the company keeps on refusing it, I guess. We get little tastes here and there, like Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards was 2D, but had some absolutely maniacal camera angles. Kirby Planet Robobot had a 3D high-score based minigame, Kirby 3D Rumble, and Kirby Star Allies on the Nintendo Switch has fully 3D world maps, but with the main game taking place as a 2D platformer, and good god my heart aches for a game in this style. We've gotten Kirby Air Ride, a 3D racing game, and Kirby 3D Rumble was expanded into a 3DS eShop game, Kirby's Blowout Blast, but these two are spin-offs, and Blowout Blast specifically is a very small game. We could really use a fully 3D Kirby game. And Sonic the Hedgehog. The mega popular 2D side-scroller series had to wait and wait until they fully realized 3D adventure. Sonic 3D Blast came out in the mid-90s, and gosh, Sonic in 3D? Who are they trying to fool here? Sonic R was a 3D racing game, Sonic Jam featured a 3D overworld to screw around in, but no true 3D Sonic game until the late 90s. Sonic Extreme was a 3D Sonic game in development for the Sega Saturn that was plagued with development issues and was eventually cancelled. It's obvious that Sega had quite a bit of trouble evolving Sonic, but it was Sonic Adventure that finally gave us a Sonic game in 3D. A lot had to be changed. Sonic was given the homing attack to home in on nearby enemies, helping fix some depth perception issues that come with 3D platforming. And developing 3D stages that utilize Sonic and his speed meant that levels had to be replayed with multiple characters to beef up playtime. It's obviously expensive making 3D Sonic levels since you go through them so fast. Adventure created a large world to roam around in, but was basically what was expected from a 3D Sonic game in the late 90s. And then Sega just didn't know what to do with this thing for the next decade. This wasn't a problem with the 2D games, they stayed relatively consistent. The 3D ones changed things up every single time a developer at Sonic Team sneezed, plus the quality of the games coming out were getting shakier and shakier. There have definitely been some really solid 3D Sonic titles, but the quality of them is undebatably less consistent than the 2D games. It's obvious that the jump from 2D to 3D was a bit shaky. I mean, just look at the series that waited until 3D was more refined.
Games had to change in this era due to 3D requiring design changes and technical constraints. However, recently developers, specifically Nintendo, have finally been able to translate their 2D game formulas into 3D. Super Mario 3D Land and 3D World play just like a 2D Mario game, but in 3D, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is like a 3D take on the original Legend of Zelda. This is great, as little technical constraints nowadays mean we can get these versions of games fully realized. But I think the limitations that came alongside the jump from 2D to 3D were monumental in helping shape how games are made today. We wouldn't be where we are without the transition and the problems that came alongside it. Game developers learned so much about game design and discovered how much fun it is to discover things, to explore, to have infinite possibilities. This era may have been a bit ugly in some cases, but it was one of the most vital parts of gaming history. Fucking Bubsy, well, I have to say, this is what you call a game. And this is what you call incompetency.
2D and 3D are some killer dimensions, and both have merit in the video game industry, but I want everything to be 3D from now on, so I'm gonna get a little help from my eye doctor. Yeah, I've had better ideas. Hey y'all, Scott here, and it's amazing to think that a company established all the way back in 1889 made this. Whoops.
Being one of the 3 major video game companies, it's a bit odd that Nintendo is the only one of them that is strictly a video game company. They don't make computers, televisions, phones, none of that. Just video games. The thing is, it wasn't always like that. Nintendo was originally established on September 23rd, 1889, over 125 years ago, which implies they haven't always made, video games. The easiest way to describe Nintendo before video games would be a toy company.
Yikes! I've never covered the toy industry before, so to get a good idea of what we're dealing with here, I'm gonna go to Five Below and grab a toy for reference. In terms of toys, it's an inflatable gator kind of day. Cashier said it was the first inflatable gator sale of the day strictly for reference material.
Originally named Nintendo Koppai, the company originated out of Kyoto and was founded by Fusahiro Yamauchi. The company's original objective? To produce and sell handcrafted Hanafuda cards. These are Hanafuda cards made by Nintendo. This deck specifically is called the Daitorio cards and features Napoleon on the case here. Daitorio translates to president, and Napoleon was an emperor, something just refuses to add up here. This is just one of the few decks Nintendo still produces, and yeah, Nintendo still puts out Hanafuda cards, some even featuring Mario characters on them. These new decks can be scooped up for around 20 bones or so, but if you want some original vintage Nintendo Hanafuda cards, well, be prepared to spend. The packaging here is incredibly nice. A hard plastic case holds the cards, and opening this, we have a silver package containing the deck. Opening that up, let's take a look at the cards themselves, and my god, these are a thing of beauty. Hanafuda cards translates to flower cards, which is fitting. These cards are very much focused on looks. Each one has wonderful art displayed here, specifically nature-oriented. They're all incredibly tiny and are made out of a hard plastic. No numbers on them like standard playing cards. The use of numbers in playing card games are replaced with art in Hanafuda-based games. This was due to gambling being banned in Japan, as it was a major problem associated with playing cards. Since Hanafuda focused on art instead of numbers, gambling wasn't as easily associated with it, although there were workarounds like assigning numbers to specific cards. Hanafuda can be used for all different kinds of card games, none of which I have the slightest clue on how to play. Nintendo Koppai was basically the cream of the crop when it came to Hanafuda cards for years, and was basically all the company did for the first few decades of its existence. In 1933, Fusahiro stepped down and his adopted son-in-law Sekiro Yamauchi took over as president, renaming the company after an unlimited partnership, Yamauchi Nintendo & Company. 1947 rolls around and Sekiro creates a distribution company, Marufuku Company Limited, to help distribute the cards. After suffering a stroke, Sekiro's heir was to be his adopted son-in-law, Shikanoho Yamauchi, but since he abandoned his family, bring in Hiroshi Yamauchi, Shikanoho's son and the longest-standing Nintendo president, holding office from 1949 to 2002. So Nintendo was a family business, but not blood family at all. Since the first 2 presidents did not have sons, they had to settle for their son-in-laws, and in the second president's case, his grandson-in-law. Hiroshi Yamauchi was the first president of Nintendo to really start taking risks and do new things, like renaming the company to the Nintendo Playing Card Company. Hiroshi started to see that playing cards could only get the company so far, especially considering that they were primarily associated with gambling, meaning the market for them was a bit limited. They didn't have wide appeal. That was until 1959, when the Nintendo Playing Card Company and Disney partnered up to pop Disney characters on Nintendo-made cards. This was a turning point for Nintendo. This venture helped broaden their playing cards appeal and bring in families and children. This was not only a huge success, but the first instance in which Nintendo garnered an audience of families and children, a market Nintendo would cater to basically for the rest of its existence. Hiroshi changed the company's name one last time from Nintendo Playing Card Company to simply Nintendo, as he was ready to experiment in other industries with the copious amounts of cash they got from the Disney card success. Like I said, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who I'll just refer to as Yamauchi from now on, wanted to expand beyond cards, and these expansions included taxis, food, a vacuum cleaner, and love hotels. Hotels specifically for quick, sexy in-and-outs. Nintendo ran sex hotels. The mere fact would make any smug uncle say,
"Well, there goes the neighborhood."
All of these products and services failed. Hard. With the card industry at a low and their other business ventures flopping, Nintendo was in bad shape in the early 60s, borderline bankrupt. It's not like nowadays when Nintendo reports a loss in a quarter, like they have billions just sitting there, they're fine. No, this was 1960s Nintendo. Definitely not a company that could afford a loss. But their experience with playing cards and the Disney venture gave them experience in the games and children's entertainment industry. So they gave toys a spin. They dabbled in the market with things like board games and whatnot, some featuring licenses from Disney, Popeye, and Ultraman. But it truly starts when one of the most integral employees that ever worked at Nintendo came into the picture. Gunpei Yokoi. Everybody talks about Shigeru Miyamoto, Eiji Aonuma, Koji Kondo, Satoru Iwata, and justifiably so, but the late Gunpei Yokoi basically crafted the Nintendo everybody fell in love with. A Nintendo that was full of creativity and fun. It wouldn't be this way without Yokoi. He was originally just a lower level maintenance employee at Nintendo helping manufacture cards. Yokoi invented a grabber device and was fiddling around with it at work one day. Yamauchi noticed and was impressed. The item was mass-produced for the Christmas season in 1966 under the name Ultra Hand. You could extend the arm and grab items like the balls with stands that it came with. The product was a huge hit and thus officially catapulted Nintendo into the toy industry. And from here on out, the vast majority of this info was gathered from BeforeMario.com, a crazy cool website dedicated to this era of Nintendo, the toy era. Incredibly high quality pictures and descriptions of the toys they released. Check it out if you're into that sort of thing. Nintendo as a toy company was the first instance of that classic Nintendo creativity shining through. Looking at a lot of these products, they're insanely cool for the late 60s, early 70s. I think if released nowadays, they'd still be really cool. They generally take a very simple concept and turn it into an incredibly fun little toy. Take, for example, the Ultra Machine. Didn't think I'd have an actual vintage Nintendo toy, did ya? Please, never doubt me. Please. Yeah, I only recently got this, and it's already one of my favorite Nintendo-related things I own. It's a pitching machine, comes with a hearty supply of balls and a plastic bat with a classy Nintendo logo on it. It's really cool, and it works far better than I think anybody would ever expect it to. This toy also marked the first time a logo similar to the iconic one we see today was used. There were a few other variants on the Ultra Machine, but I believe this was the first edition from 1967. The sheer variety of toys released during this period is staggering, everything from a love tester to an early version of Duck Hunt. Yeah, Duck Hunt. It would project ducks onto a wall and you'd shoot them with a light gun. That's insane! There's the Punch Boy, mixing exercise and fun into one toy. A Magic Set, a tabletop game called Wild Gunman, which would later be turned into an NES game, where you and an opponent just start slinging bullets at each other. Mock Rider, which again was turned into an NES game where you can shoot out a car from a launch pad. The Space Ball, which flung these top things wherever you pleased. The Power Lift, a remote-controlled forklift. Time Shock, which is like the game Perfection, where you have to put all these pieces into the right spaces before time runs out. They also made toy guns, which sounds fun, holy shit. I don't know about you guys, but I can definitely see Nintendo in a lot of these toys. Not all of them are home runs by any means, but a lot of them you can see that Nintendo charm within them. Yokoi didn't work on all toys, but was a key factor in a good chunk of them, but wanted to try his hand at video games and came out with the Game & Watch. Nintendo as a whole started to work on video games with the release of the Color TV game series of Pong consoles in the mid to late 70s. And thus, with the venture into arcades and their own home video game console, the toy era of Nintendo ended, and from there on out, they have primarily been a video game company. However, they still do throw in a fair amount of winks and nods to their past. Super Mario Maker features this bird design on their Hanafuda cards. Pikmin 3's main character's planet is named Koppai, which hails from the company's first name, Nintendo Koppai. Ultra Hand got a downloadable game on the Wii entitled Grill Off with Ultra Hand, and the portrait of Napoleon from the Daitorio Hanafuda card set can be found in Nintendo Labo's House game. I love seeing them reference this kind of stuff, and I love looking back at this era of Nintendo. It's crazy to think the same company that gave us Animal Crossing gave us a chance to score some quick
fuck. Nintendo's reign as a card, toy, and sex factory was fun while it lasted, but it's pretty nice with them as a video game company at the moment. It also seems that they never had any desire to get into the inflatable gator business, so if you excuse me, I'm going to part with this humanely. Neighborhood's going to shit.
Hey y'all, Scott here. You ever stare in front of the mirror and practice what you're about to say to somebody?
Hey, you know what they say, go yourself.
Well, I'm practicing what to say at a family reunion that's coming up. They'd probably say, oh, Scott, it's been so long, talk to me. And I'd go, Dimensions, oh, my favorite. You know, 2D just kind of happened. Nobody went, flat plane, no Z-axis. People have always been after that, their third dimension. It's the future and the solution to all your problems in marriage.
These never work.
The dimension of our dreams, and when we finally got it, I miss garbage. I mean, we could go back before 2D gaming to no D. These were the days. Who are we kidding? It's always been a battle between 2D and 3D. You could argue 4D gaming is something like virtual reality, but I will categorize 4D like movies and theme park rides do. If my chair moves, that's the fourth dimension. Maybe someday we'll get a true fourth dimension in gaming, but for now we gotta settle for Frogger 3D being the farthest we can go. These days, it's 2D and 3D living in harmony. But it wasn't always like this, at least on home consoles. It seemed like for a second there that 2D was merely a product of hardware limitations. The only reason to make a 2D game is if you're making it for Game Boy or something. If you were making a game for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, or Xbox, you knew what dimension to make it. 3D was kind of seen as the new norm for modern console games, but now that status has been changed by Kirby Star Allies. 2D games are everywhere, sitting right alongside 3D ones, but how did it get this way? Well, like I said, 2D games just kind of happened. Do you really think there was a board meeting?
Graphics.
This was just what video games were at the time. This was the extent of what could be done, but 3D was still the dream of many. What if these characters weren't flat? They could walk around in a world, not just some kind of stage play. For 2D games, the top-down perspective was usually the answer to prayers like that, but everything was still so flat, and there were only so many things you could do and places you could go. At the time, though, this was perfectly fine. But then gunshots were heard. Super Mario 64 defined 3D gaming. It existed beforehand, but did it? Most 3D games had a hearty dose of quotation marks involved. They definitely were more 3D than not, but too many 2D elements were involved to truly make them feel like there's no going back from this. Sonic 3D Blast. Yeah, okay. Wolfenstein 3D and Doom laid the foundation for the modern first-person shooter utilizing 3D environments, and while consoles dabbled in 3D games prior, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn helped popularize them as a standard, even if these consoles did 2D games a bit better. A system like the Sega Saturn wasn't designed around 3D gaming. It was supposed to be a 2D sprite powerhouse with 3D effects for the backgrounds and such. But they saw the writing on the Christ! If your console wasn't capable of playing 3D games, well, Thanksgiving's gonna be awkward. This was where the industry was heading, but even though all these 3D games were releasing, they weren't fully taking advantage of this new dimension. They almost felt like 2D games at their core, just with 3D models instead of sprites. Oh, some games just used 3D models but stuck to a 2D perspective. But in came Mario 64, showing just how game design had to evolve. It wasn't the first 3D game, but it might as well have been. It was a monumental moment for gaming. I should know, I wasn't there. But have you noticed around this time, 2D became somewhat of a product of limitations? It almost felt like 3D replaced 2D, and 2D became relegated to handhelds because that's all they could do. Most flagship gaming franchises during this time felt the need to transition to 3D, and 2D was seen as old news. The only person that would care about them would be Lincoln, and he's dead! Of course, I'm mainly referring to game series that used to be 2D adventures, which evolved when 3D was becoming widely utilized. Something like Dr. Mario 64, it makes sense as to why it's just a simple 2D puzzle game, but out of all the action-adventure titles released on the Nintendo 64, I can only think of a handful of games played from a 2D perspective. Yoshi's Story, Mischief Makers, Kirby 64, you have Super Smash Bros. And other fighting games, but that's pretty much it. If you wanted 2D Mario, Zelda, or Donkey Kong, you had to play those on Game Boy. It really felt like Nintendo was pushing most games to just be 3D on the 64, which does make me wonder why they kept Yoshi and Kirby 2D during this time. Well, they still used 3D graphics, but kept the playing field 2D. You can only go left, right, up, or down, which created the term 2.5D. What's half a Z? It's a 2D game with 3D graphics, or a 3D game played from a 2D perspective. Dead. Pay attention. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn kept 2D games on consoles alive during this era, and this is where we got some of the most gorgeous sprite art ever conceived. It was brilliantly mixed with visual effects and backgrounds that only these new systems could achieve, and showed that 2D gaming wasn't just a step towards 3D. They were two different beasts deserving the same amount of attention. We're This is the era I'm talking about when I refer to the fall of 2D gaming. The PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, and Dreamcast. If you were making a game for these platforms, it was almost certainly 3D, and if you wanted to make a 2D game, get in the car. 2D games were seen as for handhelds only, and by proxy, less important than the big 3D console games. Case in point, all of these franchises that originated in 2D all got games during this generation. Not a single console entry was 2D. Now, of course, what's the big deal? The 2D games didn't go away, you got those games on the handheld. It's like this label, what's there to question? What is this, moonshine or porn? Your 2D games never left, you just had to play them on the handheld. But because of that, they didn't feel like they were considered as important as what was on the consoles. Console games have always been the priority. Sure, you got 2 Zelda games on the Nintendo DS in between console entries, but literally every time people talk about the history of Zelda games, they always say, Twilight Princess came out, then Skyward Sword. It's almost like handheld games were treated as spin-offs sometimes, even if they had just as much, if not more integrity as whatever released on consoles. But in the end, they just weren't considered as important as console games. These handheld titles sold more than their console counterparts, but you'll barely hear people talk about the portable games. It's all about the home console ones. It's something that's always perplexed me. I always see Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, Sony pull from their classic home console games for nostalgia bait, but barely ever do so with their handheld titles by comparison. Well, I guess it's because normally console games get the bigger budgets, the bigger teams, and the bigger scopes because they can handle experiences of that size, and thus they're the bigger deals. Portable systems couldn't do as much, so budgets for games were generally smaller, and thus people generally saw games that released on handhelds as lesser and not as important than the console games. Grand Theft Auto Advance released the same day as San Andreas. Guess what happened? Most of the time, handheld variants of these series would be put in sub-series, with the console entries being direct sequels to one another. Basically, the most a lot of these handhelds could get would be prequels, side stories, etc. Systems like the Game Boy Advance could do some very light 3D stuff, but 2D was where it was most comfortable, so this was how 2D lived on at the time. Though with everything I said earlier about handhelds were home to the lesser experiences, it made 2D gaming feel unimportant. If any generation made this style feel like just a simple stepping stone to 3D, it was this one. I mean, previously you got games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, but if you wanted games like that in the following generation, you had to play it on the Game Boy Advance because the type of Castlevania game you got on consoles during that era was this. 2D games were relegated to the Game Boy Advance because that's all I could realistically do, and with these games being cheaper, smaller titles on weaker hardware, 2D was seen as inherently worth less than 3D. Now, that doesn't mean 2D was completely off the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox. The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures on GameCube had a graphical style incredibly reminiscent of A Link to the Past on SNES, though now with all kinds of effects and crumbs on the screen. Looking at reviews, critics liked a lot about it outside of the graphics. A series that consistently were 2D only skipped main entries on consoles during this time. Classic Mega Man, Kirby, Yoshi, and when they wanted to do something like a new Mega Man X game, X7 was this new experiment bringing the series into 3D, with the next entry showing us just how well that turned out. X8 brought things back to a 2D perspective, releasing around 2005, which is where the rise of 2D started to occur. Xbox Live Arcade initially started out on the original Xbox, hosting games along the likes of arcade classics and some original very simple games. You could download these games for a relatively small price, but when it made its way over to the Xbox 360, it blew up. Xbox Live Arcade became a breeding ground for smaller, bite-sized games, not just classic arcade titles. It helped create a market for simple, cheap experiences on a home console. Much like how the pick-up-and-play games worked well on handhelds, they worked just as well as downloadable games on the TV, as you could just hop into them, play them for a bit, and hop out without swapping discs. This was a godsend for retro stuff, making the classics easily accessible to the masses. Instantly downloadable, the games were smaller in file size and simpler due to their age, which made them perfect to just always have at a moment's notice on our 360s. And I think this got people to realize, wow, this isn't dog shit. 2D retro-styled games still had a place on the home consoles. There's merit to these games existing right alongside the big bombastic 3D ones. So original downloadable games were starting to get pumped out for the marketplace, some of which were retro reboots of classics, others completely new concepts. All for affordable prices. If you haven't played Peggle because of budget constraints, that's your fault.
The bank is repossessing my body.
And I think the boom of downloadable smaller games showed how much value these titles still had. A game like Bionic Commando Rearmed was far more popular than the big, gritty Bionic Commando reboot it was fundamentally made to advertise. 2D games like this were finally making a comeback on consoles. though they were still being seen as worth less than 3D ones. The Xbox Live Arcade era really messed up my perception of price points, as back then they would charge like $10 for a new Space Invaders. Now it's like, I know it's in a collection, but still, it makes me look at something like Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. That released in 2021 for $30 digitally, and I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm saying the unbelievably cheap prices of digital games from this era makes me initially look at this as overpriced. 2D games were still seen as inferior in value to 3D titles. In fact, that just goes for various things in general during this era. Downloadable games were seen as lesser than retail games. Indie games were worse than AAA ones because they would always denote on storefronts that this was an indie game, this was an Xbox Live Arcade or PlayStation Network or WiiWare game. And thankfully, eventually, they just said, why are we giving these games labels? They're all just games at the end of the day. Who cares if it doesn't have a retail presence? Who cares if it was just made by one person? They should all be given the same label, not, oh, well, this is just a downloadable only game, or, oh, this is an indie game. How about, these are all Xbox 360 games? And I think that mindset helped 2D games in the long run, as they were primed for indie development. 2D is easier and cheaper to develop at its core and in general compared to 3D. Now, because of that, you may say, well then obviously that's why the perceived value of a 2D game was lower, because they're easier and cheaper to make. And for some reason, people keep pushing that old deal out. Because it's 2D, it should be cheaper. It's easier to make than a 3D game. Yeah, okay, look up the most expensive and difficult to make movies of all time. Chances are, they're the same price to watch as the Poltergeist of Borley Forest. I guess movies may be a weird comparison. I think a comparison people don't make enough are actual games. With 3D games, there's more that can go wrong. 2D is more grounded, there's only so many possibilities. 3D, there's more to take into account, adding to developmental issues. But from what I've seen, due to that, 3D games have so much more fluff, more cutscenes, boring tutorials, parts of the gameplay that are just you walking and following somebody and doing nothing else. Does it really matter? I have full control of what I do and where I go in this environment if there's nothing to do and nowhere to go? I'm just holding up here. A lot of these 3D games like to give you the illusion of being much more than what they really are. 2D, you can't do that as much because it's more obvious when you do it. You can't bullshit as much as you can with 3D games. And I know this sounds like I prefer 2D, and no, I like both of these equally, but as more and more time passes, it's easier and easier to call 3D games out on their garbage. Like the first time this little narrow hallway passage thing happened, I thought nothing of it, but the 60th game that did it this year? It's obvious this is here to not only mask loading screens, but also increase the time spent playing the game, even if it's only by a few seconds. Which making any game that lasts hundreds of hours, it's tough. But in a 3D world, you have more space to do more things. A 2D experience can only be consumed in so many ways, which I think adds to the perception that a 2D game is worth less than a 3D one. So regardless of 2D games coming back to consoles in a more substantial way, they were still seen as games that could only be $20 or less. However, I think the main company pushing forward, trying to give 2D games the same value as any other AAA release, is Nintendo. For a while there, Nintendo sort of pushed their 2D games off to their handhelds, which again, devalued them a bit. If you wanted 2D Zelda or Mario, you mostly had to get a Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, but even then, with Mario, from 1992 to 2006, there were no original 2D games produced. They just did remakes and re-releases on the portables, which it's crazy to think there was a time when 2D Mario was basically extinct. What Nintendo did instead was invest heavily into the Wario Land series. That was their premier 2D platformer for a bit, but in 2006, Nintendo revitalized 2D Mario with New Super Mario Bros. On DS. It was a sales juggernaut and helped prove that there was still a big audience for original 2D games. With the casual appeal of systems like the DS and Wii, it became more apparent than ever how many non-gamers understood 2D gaming far more than 3D. 3D, you have to worry about a camera system, and it's like, f you, I already have a mortgage to deal with. A game like the original Super Mario Bros., most players could deal with. Hell, many found it fun. Super Mario 64? Join the occult, Dad! While millions experienced and enjoyed video games, I think this era proved that 2D wasn't just an evolutionary step to take to get to 3D. It was something that was preferable in many ways to millions. It was simpler to understand for casual players, and as great as 3D was, it was too different from 2D to be considered a replacement. I think some people almost looked at going from 2D to 3D gaming as the transition from black and white to color and film. The 2D was mostly relegated to systems that just couldn't do 3D. But in reality, revitalizing 2D games was the ticket to grow gaming that much more. While the Nintendo DS could do 3D games, most of the major titles released on it were still 2D, even if they used 3D character models. And on the Wii, Nintendo started to pump more and more money into AAA 2D console games. This all started with Super Paper Mario in 2007, reimagining the Paper Mario RPG series as a 2D platformer with RPG elements and a gimmick showing you the 3D perspective of your 2D plane. Or maybe it didn't start it, but it showed where Nintendo was heading with many of its key franchises. Backwards! Nintendo has always been a very nostalgia-heavy company. Many times they theme their games around, remember that? But that doesn't mean there can't be any innovation with their nostalgia-heavy titles. Their next major 2D console game was Wario Land Shake It, also known as Wario Land the Shake Dimension in Europe. It's offensive over there. Wario Land didn't do much sales-wise, but it was a gorgeous 2D platformer on a console with great cutscenes, artwork, and animation. It was clear more time and money were being put into games like this. Even if the title didn't sell well, the intention was there. This was the first Wario Land on a console, and they went above and beyond to make it feel like it. We got Wario World on the GameCube, a 3D Wario platformer, but Wario Land Shake It was traditional 2D as all hell, which was an important precedent to set, because 1 year later, Nintendo went all in on 2D console gaming with New Super Mario Bros. Wii. I remember my aunt wanted a Wii because, well, I loved Super Mario Bros. It clicked perfectly with the Wii's casual appeal. An old school Super Mario Bros. Game, a title like Mario Galaxy, you're gonna give Grandma a stroke with that. It didn't matter that it wasn't as visually appealing or epic and grandiose as the biggest games on the market at the time. New Super Mario Bros. Wii proved that people wanted simple 2D fun on their TVs just as much as on their handhelds. Plus, Nintendo introduced simultaneous multiplayer with this game, which became a staple in their modern 2D titles to come. Next year, we got Donkey Kong Country Returns and Kirby's Epic Yarn on Wii. Kirby's Return to Dreamland the next, and coupled with the Wii's downloadable library of old school NES and SNES games, retro-style new downloadable WiiWare titles, and the lower cost of developing games on it compared to Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the Wii became the go-to console for the resurrection of 2D console gaming. Nintendo definitely noticed that these 2D titles appeal to far more consumers than ever before. You satisfy the casual crowd with simpler games they can understand. The hardcore community is pleased by the return to the classic era of gaming. Pop a multiplayer mode on there and all's forgiven. So because of this, Nintendo made another 2D game. And another 2D game. And another. 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 Nintendo leaned too far into 2D gaming after the success of New Super Mario Bros. Wii. It just felt like they took their 3D games and pushed them off to the side. And even when they did do 3D games, they took too much inspiration from the 2D ones. The Wii U and 3DS, frankly, had too much 2D. From 2012 to 2016, it almost felt like every other game Nintendo was making was a 2D platformer. And they're great, but my god! We went from not enough of them to too much just like that. And you know what? I get it. These 2D games were obviously a smart move because 1, they had wider appeal, and 2, they were definitely easier to develop. Like, why wouldn't you make the game that'll cost less to produce and make more money? But that's the problem. Many of these didn't feel like artistic decisions made because they wanted to make a 2D game. They felt like business decisions. Make a 2D game because it's more cost effective, and with a mindset like that, many of the 2D games that came out this generation, while crazy fun, weren't necessarily exciting in terms of what they represented. They felt like another Nintendo game, and that's it. Which, I think this was one of the factors that led to Nintendo's underperformance during this generation. The 2D games have wide appeal, but generally speaking, they don't leave the same impact as a 3D one. Nintendo's 2D output felt safe, not cutting edge, but when they would put out a 3D game, they'd knock it out of the park, which just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth concerning their output of 2D platformers. Because it's obvious they can be so much more. Just look at what indies are doing. Some of the most ingenious concepts to ever grace gaming are coming from just a few people working on their own, and they're being put into 2D titles. And thankfully, the industry started to evolve. What used to be considered just indie games have become games. Some of the biggest modern successes in the industry come from them, and many of which are 2D games, ones that take inspiration from what studios did years ago, games that they just aren't as willing to put too much time, effort, and money into anymore. And these indie developers help to prove that some genres never die. Just because Castlevania and Metroid gave up for a while there doesn't mean there isn't a market for classic Castlevania and Metroid games like this anymore. The Xbox One's most iconic exclusive, in my opinion, was Cuphead. Donkey Kong Country came back with returns on Wii and Tropical Freeze on Wii U after the series was just in a dormant state of spin-offs and re-releases, and it came back to glowing reviews and great sales. These types of games always have a place in the market, and with handhelds and consoles becoming one, we've seen far more games that normally would have probably released on something like the Nintendo 3DS now appear on the Nintendo Switch alongside games like Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey. We see these games appear on PlayStation 4 or 5, Xbox Series X and S, and they don't feel out of place. which is awesome. Every game on the PlayStation Store has the same worth of each other. They're all games, and the entry level of printing a game on a disc obviously was lowered as we received so many more physical releases of smaller budget titles that normally would have been digital only. That led to more indie 2D games getting released this way. Even if it was in a limited fashion, a physical release still goes a long way in showcasing the value of said product. And with Nintendo showing there was a market for high quality 2D games on console, we've entered a bit of a 2D gaming revival renaissance within the past decade. Now, 2D Mario and Zelda can live side by side with their 3D counterparts on the same console. Games like a classic 2D Mega Man get bigger budgets and physical releases compared to the Xbox Live Arcade era where they were merely digital only. But one thing I always notice is how the value of these games always seem to be lower. Mega Man 11 was only $30, Sonic Mania was $20, yet these games are far better and gave me so much more to do than something like the Resident Evil 3 remake. So yeah, while 2D games are a bit more straightforward and shorter most of the time, I'd rather be spending that entire 5-hour playtime actually playing the game rather than for half of it watching cutscenes that are available on YouTube, or even when I am playing the game, it's literally just holding the stick up as the character's walking and talking. That's not every 3D game, believe me, I love both of these styles equally, and for how often 3D games have filler, 2D games aren't exciting and too safe, it kind of balances out. But the idea that a 2D game shouldn't be priced at $60, have you seen what you're buying? How is this, and this, and this, and this worth 60, hell, even 70? But Metroid Dread isn't worth 60. It's up to the consumer to decide how much they're willing to spend on a game. If a certain title isn't worth 60 to you, well, it isn't worth 60 to you, that's fine. But to denounce a game's price entirely based on it not having a Z-axis is a little ridiculous in my opinion. 2D gaming has gone from handheld only to dominating Nintendo's entire lineup to being in a great balance with 3D titles. I love I can see games from the same franchise on the same console, both released via physical media at the same price, but from two completely different dimensions.
And then I'd say, what a family reunion! Where did everybody go?
Hey y'all, Scott here, and I've just been promoted at my job to the title of stay-at-home son. Suffice to say, I've had a lot of extra time on my hands, and I've been discovering the legends of lost video games. Someone please hire me.
Games are a medium in which preservation can be tricky, thus some games can't be played in their original state. These are games that have basically been lost, not games that were canceled, but games that existed and were playable, but are inaccessible nowadays. These are the games that time forgot. NBA Elite 11, a crowning achievement in the canceled but not canceled industry. EA initially developed Elite 11 as a reboot of the NBA Live series. 2010 was a crazy pro Elite anti-live time. After a lame demo was put out for the game showcasing various problems and glitches, EA realized the product just wasn't up to snuff and thus canceled the release of the game. Or did they? Copies of the game were shipped to retailers, but EA requested them to be sent back. Most obliged, but some copies were sold to consumers. Due to never officially releasing, but technically officially releasing, NBA Elite 11 is incredibly hard to play. If you want to grab the game, well, the demo that initially released was completely ripped from online stores, making this one of the hardest EA Sports games to experience. Thank God you made the cut. Hey, remember Download Play on the Nintendo DS? It was a way for you to temporarily download content from another DS without an internet connection, mainly for things like playing a multiplayer game without your own copy of the game. It's pretty slick. Download Play was also used to issue demos to players. The main way I remember this was through the Wii. You could boot up the Nintendo channel and download demos for DS games to your DS, but you could also get exclusive demos by using Download Play in specific areas like retail stores. However, we have an exclusive game that was only available via DS Download Play. Visiting the Poke Park, a Pokemon theme park in Japan, you could download an exclusive DS game to your system, Poke Park Asari Takai DS. It's a Pokemon fishing game, that's it. The way DS Download Play works is that after your system is shut down or after 12 hours, the game is inaccessible, and the fact that this game was only available in a theme park that's totally dead now, Pokemon's triumphant leap into the fishing genre just refuses to be played nowadays. Here's a plethora of games that were delivered via online services in the early 90s, back when the internet was delivered via railroads or whatever. Yes, various game systems in this era kinda sorta supported online, but in different ways compared to how online support is handled nowadays. The Satellaview and Sega Channel were online services for the Super Famicom and Sega Genesis respectively. The Satellaview was more of a satellite broadcast modem offering games to be played at specific times, almost like the games were a radio broadcast you had to tune into. In fact, the way the games were delivered was basically like a radio broadcast. The games offered on the service varied from add-ons to remakes to remixes of previous games to just full-on new games. But this method of games delivery came with a caveat. Most, if not all of these games would not officially be re-released in any physical way, and thus fans had to step up to ensure these games could be played for generations to come by backing up the files online. The only way to get these games legitimately nowadays is to grab a Satellaview with the cartridge and memory pack, hopefully with previously broadcasted game data on it. A good majority of the Satellaview broadcasted games can be played now via emulators, and unofficial reproduction cartridges exist of various games, but many are not in their original state. For example, an expansion to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was released entitled Ancient Stone Tablets and featured a narrator speaking to the player alongside orchestrated music being streamed. While Ancient Stone Tablets can be played on an emulator nowadays, it's never been officially re-released by Nintendo, and the narrator and orchestrated music is completely lost. Another one is Kirby's Toy Box, a collection of games broadcasted via this service. They were minigames, basically an expansion of Kirby Superstar. Most of the minigames have been found, backed up, and can be played online right now, except for one. The game entitled Ball Rally is still lost and can't be played unless you just so happen to have a Satellaview with the game on it, which is something that has yet to surface. Just a few years ago, a good chunk of the Kirby's Toy Box games that were believed to be lost did end up surfacing, so don't completely count this one out just yet. But get ready for the most heart-wrenching lost game broadcast of them all. Garfield Caught in the Act Lost Levels. The Sega Channel for Sega Genesis was kind of Sega's version of the Satellaview, and similar to it, Sega offered some exclusive games on the service like Mega Man: The Wily Wars and Alien Soldier. Garfield Caught in the Act was offered to play, but also saw release as a physical cartridge. However, a handful of levels didn't make the cut in the final release and were finished for the Sega Channel version of the game. Many have nicknamed this as Garfield the Lost Levels, as they are completely lost. However, these levels are available on the Game Gear and PC versions of the game. It's not confirmed, but it's safe to assume that while these versions may be similar, they probably aren't one-to-one the same level designs as the levels on the Sega Channel version, which are gone and will most likely never resurface.
No.
The dependency many games have on online stores scares the piss out of me. So many games are digital only and can be taken off of the stores at any moment, making it almost impossible to play them. A good amount of the time, these games are taken off for licensing reasons. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game is a huge one that was taken off Xbox Live Arcade and the PlayStation Network. Being a retro-style beat-em-up based on the movie based on the graphic novels, this one has gained quite a following, so it's sad to see you can't play it anymore if you want to. Turtles in Time Reshelled was a reimagining of the arcade and SNES classic Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 Turtles in Time, and yikes, I don't think a ton of people dug this one, so who cares that it's gone? The Simpsons arcade game was removed from XBLA and PSN, and that was already a game people were having a hard time getting a hold of to play. It was a bit of a miracle to see the game re-released on these platforms at all, so at least it did happen even though it was short-lived. Nintendo specifically did this with the enhanced re-release of The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords on DSiWare to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Zelda series. It was always positioned as a free limited release, and it's been unavailable for years at this point. One of the most infamous delistings in recent memory, PT, a free playable teaser for the cancelled horror game Silent Hills. After the game's director Hideo Kojima and publisher Konami had a falling out, not only was Silent Hills cancelled, but PT was just absolutely eviscerated off the PlayStation Store. The only way you can play it today is if you still have it downloaded on your PlayStation 4, and even then, if you delete it, you can't even re-download it. This one's a bit of an odd bugger. You know the Mario and Sonic at the Olympic games, right? Everybody's favorites. Well, the winter variant on the Wii and DS received a mobile phone version called Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games, only featuring Sonic characters. It's been taken down, and we don't have a way to play it anymore. How unfortunate. I always wanted to play curling as Vector the Crocodile on my phone. Holy shit, I need to work on my life goals. Mario Roulette is an incredibly rare and obscure Japanese arcade game released by Konami. It's basically what it sounds like, a Mario Roulette featuring similar graphics to those found in the bonus stages from Super Mario World, but the only way you can play it today is if you find one. And spoilers, Jesus Christ, that's never going to happen. This is such an obscure rare release that not only is it nearly impossible to find, but even more difficult to back up online because, it's never happened. The online multiplayer component of many games have been shut down. Looking at the games using the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection on the Wii and DS, multiplayer's donezo on a lot of those titles, but massive multiplayer online games are completely toast. When those things are shut down, it's completely game over. Many games are kept alive via fan servers, but more times than not, MMOs that die forever. It isn't always apparent just how fragile media can be. The Film Foundation estimated that over 90% of films before 1929 have been lost forever, which is way past unfortunate. That's history right there that never got justifiably preserved. Of course, with film, books, music, and the sort, these forms of media can be displayed and preserved in a multitude of ways now. Video games are a different story. Games are dependent on the hardware in which they were designed for. Movies, music, and books don't have that problem. They're all generally in formats that can be displayed on any computer, or any DVD or CD, or just pieces of paper. Games are trickier. The fact that they're designed for specific hardware in mind makes it more difficult to preserve. Many point to emulation, which of course emulates a specific video game console on different hardware, and yes, that's an excellent way to preserve games, especially and in my opinion, preferably when it's officially endorsed by the companies who originally made the game. Recent releases like the Mega Man Legacy collections are emulations of some classics, which many purists may scoff at, but in my opinion, if they play and look as they should, I commend re-releases like this, as it ensures that these games are readily available to play and won't be lost to history. But of course, not everything can be preserved, and we just have to live with that. I would love to get my hands on a lot of these games someday, but I'm not giving my hopes up. Honestly, the fact that some of these games are lost to history makes them more interesting in some cases, and potentially gives them more notoriety than if they were readily available. But it still would be nice to have hard copies of all these games. Of course, when talking about games that are lost and can't be played anymore, everybody has to mention Club Penguin, an online game where you just bro out with other people all displayed as penguins. You see, I never played Club Penguin, I was always more of a Nicktropolis guy, which suffered the same fate.
Well, with these online chat room kids games gone forever, I guess I'm gonna have to relive what it's like to be a kid in one of these things by just going to a chat room and posing as a 12-year-old. Gotta ask this person how old they are these days first off, and with the age-old age question being thrown out there, I think I'm gonna leave it at young. 18? Get out of here. Think young, go younger. Don't worry guys, we're in an online chat room. These people are wholesome with a capital H. Scratch that. Hey y'all, Scott here. E3 2018 you say? Never heard of him. I'm more so interested in demonstrating the potential of hardware. Let's see if this iron passes the durability test. Gonna put that down as a TBA. Tech demos, demonstrations of hardware potential that most of the time have no business being real games. Whenever new hardware is revealed, saying it has 4 gallons of teraflops lodged in it means nothing if we can't see it getting put to good use. Developers have to cobble together something that people can look at and instantly understand just how good games can look, sound, feel, play, all that. These are some of the most interesting parts of a new console generation. These are what could be, rather than what is most of the time. I think it's fair to say the vast majority of tech demos never amount to anything and don't become full-fledged video games. They're just here to visualize a hardware's tech specs. That's not to say they can't become full games or elements from them can't be used on other games. However, developers just have a hankering to tease and decide to make tech demos that look like games people have been begging for, which can be just absolutely cruel if that game isn't actually in development. Take, for example, a Zelda tech demo for the GameCube showcasing a sword fight between Link and Ganondorf. Who's gonna win? A Zelda game for babies, that's who! We know now that The Wind Waker is a fantastic Zelda game, but back then people were expecting Zelda on the GameCube to look mature, epic, a bit dark, and they got this. People were upset because Nintendo showed them this thing they really wanted and didn't give it to them. At first. Tech demos can be pretty cool, but sometimes they end up just disappointing fans. So I will pose the question, what makes a good tech demo? Well, let's take a look at various tech demos from the past and see if we can figure that out for ourselves. Now we can't just talk tech demos and end it there. Today I am introducing the Tech Demometer, patent pending. Each tech demo we look at will be ranked on a scale of 1 to 3 based on completely inconsistent judgment. Don't overthink the ratings, let's just do it. Oh my god, are they remaking Final Fantasy VII in HD? I think they're remaking Final Fantasy VII in HD! They're remaking Final Fantasy VII in HD! This tech demo was shown off at E3 2005 as a showcase for the PlayStation 3 hardware and is a remake of the opening section of Final Fantasy VII. It's just a short clip and honestly doesn't seem that much better than something from the PlayStation 2 or Xbox at the time. Actually, let me rephrase that. Stuff like character models and overall detail in the world is definitely early PS3 quality, but nothing here screams, oh yeah, this shows the power of the PlayStation 3. It felt like a PS2 era cutscene running in real time. Impressive,
but not jaw-dropping. All this did was make fans sit there and ask, so when's the Final Fantasy VII Remake coming out? Tech demos don't have to become a game that actually releases commercially, but look at this and tell me, oh yeah, just a tech demo, has no business being a real game. After you see the rest of the tech demos we'll be looking at, you can't look at this one and say, that just looks like a tech demo. The fact that this wasn't linked to any potential remake kinda makes me ask the question, what was the point in making this if all it did was end up disappointing fans? The director of the original Final Fantasy VII defended the decision on making the tech demo 9 years later in 2014 by saying that it was the right thing to do at the time. Sure, it makes sense to take something people are familiar with and enhance it this much to show the leap in graphical capabilities, but the way this looks and the way it's presented heavily implies this can be and should be more than a tech demo. Well, 10 years after the tech demo, a Final Fantasy VII Remake was officially announced for the PlayStation 4. And just like the tech demo, nothing has happened since. It just seems like this thing has been crab walking in development hell. This tech demo did its job to excite people, but for all the wrong reasons. I don't think it got people excited for the power of the PlayStation 3, it got people excited over a game that didn't exist. Hey, Mario Kart XXL, I see this was in the era where they were naming tech demos after TV dinners. This wasn't a demo created by Nintendo, instead by Denaris Entertainment Software, somebody's favorite developer. This was an unauthorized prototype showing how the GBA could render 2 background layers at once, plus also utilizing fully rendered 3D characters. I gotta be honest, this looks pretty impressive for the Game Boy Advance. I don't think anybody knows if this was actually pitched to Nintendo at any point, but regardless, never became a game, still cool though and really seems to utilize the GBA hardware well. This is an interesting one. When the PS4 was initially revealed, this demo of an old man's face was shown, but it was at E3 2013 that a full tech demo showcasing the old man was revealed entitled The Dark Sorcerer, developed by Quantic Dream, who developed this downer of an experience, so it's surprising to see them make this tech demo that is completely self-aware and is more of a comedy. I gotta be honest, this is one of the most fun tech demos ever made. It has fun with itself and doesn't come off as teasing fans or unimpressive. It's interesting on its own, but doesn't need to be a full game. It's both a short film and a tech demo. Give this one the full points it deserves. Back when the Kinect was introduced as Project Natal, an infamous tech demo was shown alongside it, presented by Peter Molyneux himself. Project Milo, a demo that involved artificial intelligence, so intelligent it was artificial.
Hiya Milo, how you doing?
Hi Claire, you okay?
Actually, I'm a bit nervous.
You? Nervous? I don't believe it.
Basically, you could talk to a video game character and he'd talk right back effortlessly. Maybe a little too effortlessly.
You've got to put these goggles on.
Goggles?
Put them on like this.
Notice what she did. This wasn't acted. She felt the need to reach down.
That's because it's acted.
I always had a feeling this was a bit faked. Like, have you ever used a Kinect on the Xbox 360 before? The thing had a hard time figuring out if I had a body. You're expecting me to think it could have a realistic conversation with me? Also, look how fast the Kinect scans in this piece of paper. Like, no. No, that can't be. Listen, this was and still is conceptually really cool, and the fact is there that the original concept of Kinect was much more technologically advanced than the retail product. But this is the only instance where we saw Project Milo in action, so it's hard to believe that it was really that immersive and expansive. Really, the developers could have only programmed the amount of interactivity we saw in the video, like Milo would only be able to respond to the specific things said by that woman, and we wouldn't know any better. But I'll give it 2 points for being pretty cool in the grand scheme of things, and being some pretty cool use of the hardware. Back when the Game Boy Advance was coming out, Nintendo created this demo that is a remake of Yoshi's Story on the Nintendo 64. A Nintendo 64 game running on a Game Boy Advance? Not really. Like I said, it's obviously a remake of the game that runs on the Game Boy Advance. The presentation has been downgraded a fair amount, but I gotta be honest, this is still pretty impressive. It's like how Nintendo remade Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo DS just to prove that the system can do 3D. The problem is that game is tart, while this one never came out and is just as, if not more impressive than 64 DS, just because, hey, it's basically playing a Nintendo 64 game on the hardware that preceded the DS. That's pretty cool. This never became a real-life thing, but unlike the Final Fantasy VII tech demo, this demo wasn't this big extravaganza that was a complete overhaul of how the original game was. This was just proving that the Game Boy Advance was more powerful than many may have assumed, and I think it did its job fairly well. Back when Nintendo was desperately trying to prove the Wii U gamepad's worth, E3 2014 brought with it 2 Wii U tech demos focusing on the 2-screen dynamic. One was Project Guard, a tower defense game where you had to swap between certain camera angles to stop enemies from harming your base. The other was Project Giant Robot, where you're a Project Giant robot and you're doing specific missions in a city. Guard was turned into the game Star Fox Guard, where it was basically the same but with a Star Fox theme, and Giant Robot was never officially turned into a full game. However, it's speculated that the Nintendo Labo Robot Kit is what became of the project. I thought Guard was kind of a cute use of the gamepad, but Giant Robot always looked like a clunk fest. They worked pretty well as tech demos, but here's the problem. They came out 2 years after the console released. That definitely takes away a lot of the oomph out of a tech demo. Oh, Conker the Squirrel. Definitely at the top of everybody's top 10 alcoholic video game squirrels list is of course the star of the cult classic Nintendo 64 game Conker's Bad Fur Day. After Microsoft purchased the developer Rare, the Conker franchise hasn't been touched all too much. A remake of Bad Fur Day was thrown onto the original Xbox, but other than that, the series has remained relatively dormant. And then, yeah, Young Conker was a tech demo created to demonstrate the tech behind Microsoft HoloLens. Using augmented reality, the thing is actually quite impressive. Other than that, it's a bit of a spit in the face to Conker fans. It's one of the few representations the series has had in the past decade, and it's not at all how fans want to see this character or play something he's in. They could have built this demo around any other character or series, a series that has had more releases or support as of late. But no, make it a cult classic that fans desperately want to see return and make it an augmented reality demo. Neat. And while we're on the topic of Rare IP tech demos, what the hell was this? Taking Banjo-Kazooie and making it a motion-controlled experience? I don't know what you would call this. Mario tech demos. Let's take a look at these bad boys. Well, Mario 128 seems to be the most well-known. Made to show the power of the GameCube, the title alludes to this being a sequel to Mario 64, but after further inspection, yeah, no. It was constantly stated to be more than just a tech demo, and it would eventually become a full game, but I can't look at 128 Marios running around and immediately state, yeah, that's a game. Cool tech for back in the day, though. Peach's Castle was a demo, again for the GameCube, and was just a large tour of the castle. Neat shit. Luigi's Mansion was once used for tech demo purposes before initially being revealed as a game. You could play with Mario and Wario's face on the DS when it was initially shown. New Super Mario Bros. Me? God, I thought these tech demos were going to be way more interesting than they turned out. Holy shit, look at all the ping pong balls! Now I gotta get an original Xbox. What better hardware to try to prove the worth of than the Sega 32X, the 32-bit add-on for the Sega Genesis. Here's some rad 90s graphics that Sega threw out there to show just how powerful the 32X is, and whoa, this is literally just a bunch of primitive 3D junk flying at us. This demo knows how to fucking rivet. Now you may have noticed that most of these never reach a solid 3 in the tech demometer, probably because tech demos are never meant to be perfect. They're interesting parts of history, and when new hardware is unveiled, it's cool to see what it's capable of. But it's all about the games that are, you know, actually real. After all this, what does make a good tech demo? And I think the simple answer is something that showcases a hardware's potential without toying with fans' hearts. Most of the time, tech demos aren't representative of any final product, so they can mainly be seen as harmless. They aren't like a yearbook quote which is stuck with you for life. Of course, when I was in the room with the yearbook committee, they took the last thing that I said as my yearbook quote, and when you're in a room full of fucking weirdos, that's how you get a quote that becomes, "Stop licking my neck!" Hey y'all, Scott here, and I'm freaking out here. I was outside, and I heard somebody say one of the numbers in my soch. Privacy is my #1 concern, alright? I don't want anybody to know anything about me. For Christ's sakes, I blur out my inkjet numbers. You may ask why I'm so keen on privacy. Where did it all begin? Well, let me ask you this. How the hell did we learn about Geist DS? That game was canceled. We weren't supposed to know anything about it, but now we know everything about it. Really, anything can get revealed at this point. Here's my blood type, damn it! Video games are a tricky bunch, and development of them can be wild. I mean, how many times have you seen a developer interview where they say, yeah, it was pretty easy? Any video game that makes it to market is sort of a miracle. The amount of working coordination that has to go into making even the worst games ever makes it unsurprising how many game projects never got completed. Whether it's due to the publisher, the development team, market conditions, a lack of resources, or any of these other fun words I found in the dictionary, thousands of video games since the dawn of time have been canceled before an official release and have never been publicly available. Some video game cancellations are absolutely shocking and disheartening, and others are Project Giant Robot for Wii U. How did Silent Hills not make it to store shelves but Mega Flarp did? Well, let's delve into the world of canceled video games to understand how this came out, but this didn't. Now we can't look at every single video game that's ever been canceled, so this is more so a general roundup of a bunch of canceled games throughout history. Who knows, maybe in the future we can talk about more canceled games as a whole, or dive deeper into a specific cancellation. If you want to look more into games that have never seen the light of day, I highly recommend checking out unseen64.net. This is where the majority of information on these canceled games lies nowadays, and you're sure to find something wild here. The 8th generation of game consoles had some of the most infamous cancellations of all time in my opinion, the most heartbreaking of which was Project Rap Rabbit.
Please care.
A failed Kickstarter campaign for a spiritual successor to Parappa the Rapper, with a goal of raising enough money to buy a nice cigar. After the Kickstarter failed at even getting close to not failing, they put development on an indefinite hold, which was a nice way to say it was cancelled, of course. Are you fucking stupid? Now, what overshadows Project Rap Rabbit's cancellation? Well, not much, but this'll do. Star Wars 1313 was supposed to be a huge leap forward for Star Wars games. It was going to be much more mature and leverage the power of the 8th generation consoles. But then Disney decided to go forward with the mission statement of the entire company. Buy Lucasfilm, cancel 1313. They shut down LucasArts and subsequently canceled all of their projects at the time, with Star Wars 1313 being one of them. Silent Hills, however, is possibly the most notorious cancellation of this generation. The Silent Hill franchise was just sort of existing at the time. The survival horror genre was kind of struggling, but then a free game was put out entitled PT, short for Playable Teaser. At the end, it was revealed to be the announcement for a new Silent Hill game being produced by Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro. Like, that would ever happen. Internal conflicts with the publisher Konami and Kojima led to him leaving the company and Silent Hills being wiped from existence. Even with PT, Konami's trying their hardest to ensure nobody even thinks of that thing anymore by pulling it off of the PlayStation Store. After LA Noire, Team Bondi decided to work on, well, I can't say that. It was going to reuse a lot of the technologies developed for LA Noire and feature comparable gameplay elements. However, this was set in 1930s Shanghai. Officially, only one screenshot was ever released, but full gameplay was leaked. Warner Brothers was originally going to publish it, but backed out later on. In the end, they really just couldn't secure a publisher and enough funding. Killer Freaks from Outer Space. This was one of the first Wii U titles revealed. Back when E3 associated itself with the year 2011, and Nintendo officially announced the Wii U alongside a bunch of killer games. Pretty much the only concrete game they announced was Lego City. We got some third-party multi-platform ports promised, with many not coming true, the concept of Smash Brothers coming out for Wii U and 3DS and not much else, some tech demos, and that was pretty much it. But Ubisoft announced an exclusive title of their own, that being Killer Freaks was a first-person shooter focused on shooting aliens and not much else. This was cancelled and reworked into Zombie U 1 year later. How the fuck? Project Giant Robot was a game created to make the Wii U gamepad seem worthwhile, and that was it. Just a tech demo for the system that was all about making a giant robot and wreaking havoc as it. It was announced alongside Project Guard, which did end up releasing as Star Fox Guard. I would have assumed that this was just a tech demo, but Nintendo kept reaffirming that they were intending on releasing it for the Wii U as a full game. And I'm sure we all know how that turned out. Just think where the Wii U would be if this game released. It's speculated that the Nintendo Labo robot kit was what came of this game. I don't think that's been confirmed. Imagine being Microsoft and saying no 3 whole times. Phantom Dust was going to be a remake of the original Xbox game, and they just couldn't do it. You see, the developer of the remake was doing well with it. They asked Microsoft for more money, they said no, and canceled it, forcing the developer to shut down and lay off all their employees.
That could have gone better.
I mean, technically Phantom Dust did come out on the Xbox One, but they just remastered the original instead of remaking it from the ground up. At least they made this one for free as a nice little way to say, hey, it ain't game much better than this. Fable Legends was always a game I could count on never coming out. Each time I check on its development, it'd be like, it's coming. Whoops. Again, this led to the closure of the development team, Lionhead Studios. Thankfully, with Scalebound, this game's cancellation didn't shutter its developers' doors, but it almost did. Scalebound was a game Platinum's wanted to make for years, and Microsoft finally gave them the opportunity to crush their dreams. Actually, both parties weren't too sure of the title as development progressed. They were worried about meeting fan expectations, and they felt they bit off more than they could chew. Microsoft announced the game was done for by saying, Scalebound is cancelled, please buy Halo Wars 2. But nothing will ever top the amount of 3DS games cancelled. I would have taken a bullet for DJ Hero 3D. At the 3DS's announcement during E3 2010, tons of third-party games were revealed via logos, stuff like Assassin's Creed Lost Legacy and Saints Row Drive-By. But they were cancelled pretty much within the year they were announced, with barely any screenshots or footage to their names. Some speculate it was because 3DS sales were pretty slow near its launch, others assume it was because of 3DS hardware limitations or the audience of the platform just not fitting these games. Lost Legacy became Assassin's Creed Revelations, and Saints Saints Row Drive-By became not Assassin's Creed Revelations, that's for sure. I mean, I probably wouldn't have bought these games if they did come out. It's cool if they would have, but these just aren't the kind of games I wanted to play on the 3DS. Imagine that. All these games, and I was still just gonna buy the 3DS for Pilot Wings Resort. Ubisoft probably asked themselves, what the hell are we doing here, and pulled the plug. DJ Hero 3D was going to be the most immersive DJ Hero yet. Literally, it was gonna be DJ Hero on the 3DS. What a world we would have lived in. The demo was playable at E3 2010, but in early 2011, Activision canceled the entire Guitar Hero franchise and its spin-offs. No more games were in development due to declining sales, which meant DJ Hero 3D, it wasn't gonna make it. Bomberman for 3DS. It was announced, the developer Hudson Soft got absorbed into Konami, it didn't come out. Kaio King of Pirates was some penguin game that was made by Keiji Inafune, who worked on the Mega Man series before he left Capcom. It was revealed in 2011 and was cancelled a good 4 years later. Apparently it would have played like a Warriors game, but the reveal trailer was all we really got. And I don't know why, but this penguin is lodged in the back of my brain and something that might pop in my head if I think of the 3DS randomly. On the topic of Keiji Inafune and Mega Man, let's shift over to Mega Man Legends 3. It was announced in September 2010, but barely. The game itself wasn't really announced, rather the prototype of the game was announced. They were gonna put out the prototype on the 3DS's eShop when it launched in the summer of 2011 to gauge interest in the title and to receive feedback. That never happened, and they just canceled everything, the nerve of them. But hey, at least it wasn't BioShock for the Vita. You wanna know how much we got on this? Just that. That's it. That's all we got. It never came out. Man, imagine what it's like to be BioShock Vita. The 7th generation of consoles, back when DJ Hero After Party was canceled, they had no mercy. Heroes the video game. If this game came out, okay. If this game got canceled, okay. I have absolutely no opinion either way. Prey 2. Now, that was a game that was seemingly canceled for no reason. It was apparently due to business politics and the sort. It was announced in 2011 and looked pretty good, and then Bethesda said, nah, it looks like trash, and canceled it in 2014. Before the cancellation, the original developer Human Head was taken off the project, and it moved over to Arcane, where they pretty much started from scratch before the project was ultimately scrapped. However, Arcane was able to develop their own take on Prey, and that released in 2017. A Warrior's Lair would have been a PS3 and Vita game, with the main gimmick being switching between the two consoles to pick up where you last played. But who cares about that when Bonk Brink of Extinction and Clay Fighter Call of Putty were cancelled? This was the big retro revival era of downloadable games. I mean, were you really expecting them to not try to reboot Bonk and Clay Fighter? Bonk was another victim of the Hudson absorption and was cancelled because of it. And Clay Fighter? I don't know, it just stopped existing. A first-person Avengers game with an emphasis on co-op by THQ. Now, when I think THQ, my mind immediately goes to games on par with WALL-E for PlayStation 2, but near the end of their tenure, THQ was trying to turn the company around from mostly cheap licensed kids games to some bigger, better titles, with the Avengers game being one of them. It honestly sounded fairly promising, but THQ was just refusing to make a profit during this time and ended up having to scrap the project due to a lack of funding. Time Splitters 4. This game just kept on getting the old yeah it's happening treatment whenever people asked about its status, because we really never knew much about it. Some teasers here and there, some information like, oh yeah, it's gonna use this engine or gonna be on this platform, but nope. Project Hammer. Now here's a title I can get behind. What the f is a theater rhythm? No thank you. I'll stick to Hammer Game. I mean, look at it. What else did you expect from that title? You swing a hammer around to whack things. It was originally for the Wii, being developed by Nintendo Software Technology. They're a studio in North America who developed stuff like Wave Race, but after Project Hammer got canceled, they've been banished to making just Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, a fate worse than death. This game was revealed at E3 2006, and that was it. No more information. This was all Nintendo wanted to show us. After its cancellation in 2009, NST tried to make a new Wave Race game for the Wii, and that got shut down, but at least we saw the minis march again. Super Mario Spikers was supposed to be a new sports game in the same vein as Mario Strikers, an extreme take on soccer with Mario characters. But Spikers was to be an extreme take on volleyball and wrestling, Jesus Christ. It was done by Next Level, the same guys behind Strikers, and it was cancelled in 2007 due to being a bit too violent for Mario. A gritty, more mature reboot of Kid Icarus was being developed for the Wii by Factor 5. This thing wouldn't stop getting rumored about back in the Wii days, but yeah, it was a thing, and I am very glad that Kid Icarus Uprising got made instead. Look at this guy. Mega Man Universe was a famous example of the great Mega Man cancellations of the 2010s. We already talked about Legends 3, but that was barely even in development by the time it got canceled. Mega Man Universe was going to be a downloadable Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network game that allowed players to create and share their own Mega Man stages. It was heavily based on Mega Man 2, but featured its own god-awful art style. It It was pretty much done from what I could gather, but Capcom pulled the plug on it on March 31st, 2011. Great timing. Then there was the cancelled Maverick Hunter, the first-person Mega Man X reboot, just what everybody wanted. Metroid Dread was always one of the most mysterious games that never released. It was never formally unveiled, but it was never formally cancelled. It just sort of showed up as a rumor from Game Informer in 2005. Apparently, it was a 2D Metroid for the DS. Rumors floated around for years, and even an Easter egg made it into Metroid Prime 3, stating, "The Metroid Project Dread is nearing completion." Nintendo denied the rumor that they were working on a 2D Metroid, but the series producer eventually stated that the project did exist at one point, but was scrapped. Just like My Life Coach on the DS. Katamari, Geist, and Gauntlet games were all planned for the DS, but these were all cancelled, with Gauntlet being the farthest along, as in, it was completely finished and they cancelled it for some reason. It was actually going to be a very impressive game for the DS. Both screens would display 3D graphics at the same time, it had local and online play, and online voice chat. But hey now, the PSP had some cancelled games too, like Far Cry, Saints Row Undercover, Earthworm Jim, and a Resident Evil game announced at E3 2009. Technically, this one was never actually cancelled, just nothing's come of it, but mark my words, Resident Evil PSP will eventually come out, I swear. Rainbow Six Patriots, that was cancelled, but it became Siege, so it's fine. The 6th generation had way too many cancelled games to count, so we gotta pick the games to discuss wisely here. Big comfy couch on Xbox. With Microsoft buying Rare, most of their projects in the works for the GameCube and Game Boy Advance either had to be reworked or cancelled. One of the most infamous being Donkey Kong Racing, a bit of a successor to Diddy Kong Racing. With Rare being a Microsoft company after the buyout, they couldn't develop for Nintendo home consoles anymore, so they tried to rework Donkey Kong Racing into Saberman Stampede. That didn't come out either, so move over Donkey Kong Racing, we got late instead. Rare games couldn't catch a break this generation, especially Conker's Bad Fur Day 2 or Conker's Other Bad Day. A sequel to the original was planned but ultimately got cancelled, similar to another Conker game worked on for the Xbox, Conker Gettin' Medieval. This was more spin-off than sequel though, being a third-person shooter. There was Velvet Dark, a cancelled spin-off of Perfect Dark following Joanna Dark's sister, and then various Banjo-Kazooie games. One was planned for the GameCube, if this GameCube tech demo Rare put together is trustworthy enough, and others were planned after Microsoft bought Rare. Banjo X was going to be a remake of the original Banjo-Kazooie that would change dramatically as time went on to surprise players. This kind of reminds me of Conker Live and Reloaded, a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day that did change some things here and there, kind of poking fun at being a remake. There was also Banjo-Kazooie, which focused on building your own vehicles, and that became not Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, that's for sure. X-Girl was a girlfriend simulator planned for the Xbox. That would have been great. You would just have a virtual girlfriend. It's everything my mom wouldn't want. Fallout Extreme. This sounds interesting. I'll look it up on Wikipedia. Fallout Extreme was in development for several months in 2000, but was canceled.
I blinked, what?
A tactical game for the Xbox and PS2. It didn't get too far into development and was never officially announced. Now, Sonic Extreme was a pitch for a Sonic skateboarding game on the Xbox that went nowhere, but a Skater Die reboot did go somewhere alright. You know Skater Die on the NES, right? That thing that wasn't good? Well, Criterion, who made Burnout, worked on a reboot and it actually looked pretty promising. And I have absolutely nothing backing this up, but it was being published by EA. It could have been linked to the eventual creation of Skate. Charlie Brown's All-Stars. If a baseball game featuring this Charlie Brown model seems like your thing, I have terrible news for you. Before Retro Studios worked on Metroid Prime, they had loads of other games in development for the GameCube, including NFL Retro Football, Thunder Rally, and Action Adventure, but the most well-known canceled retro game was Raven Blade, an epic RPG that was scrapped to make room for old Prime over here. Castlevania Resurrection was being developed for the Dreamcast and was going to be in the style of the Nintendo 64 Castlevanias. It was canceled because, remember, Dreamcast. But hey, at least over on the PS2 and Xbox, Konami was working on Contra Online. I wanted to talk about Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness 2, but I have nothing to say. The 5th generation of consoles. Lots of cancellations during this just due to being a big transitional period for developers, going from 2D to 3D. Lots of projects just ended up not working out. Sonic Extreme, not Sonic Extreme, Sonic Extreme, is one of the most famous cancellations of this era. The Sega Saturn didn't have its own original Sonic platformer, and Extreme was set to be the big Sonic title for the system. However, development was brutal, especially on the employees working on the game, with some getting incredibly sick. Sega had to delay and eventually cancel the game due to development just not progressing well in any way. But to help make the cancellation sting a little less, they put out a Saturn version of Sonic 3D Blast. me. It was obvious Sega wanted to combat Mario 64 with their own 3D Sonic platformer on the Saturn, but Nintendo was already planning to strike back with a sequel to Mario 64, never mind. A big element of Super Mario 64 2 would have been multiplayer. Luigi would appear in the game after being absent from the first one alongside Yoshi being rideable. This would have appeared on the Nintendo 64 DD, the disk drive, an add-on only available in Japan. But because nobody owned a 64 DD and the sequel's development just wasn't really going anywhere, work on it was scrapped. But it's fair to say elements from the game were definitely used on future Mario titles. Nintendo was working on so many games for the 64 DD, and because the add-on flopped hard, these games either just released via a standard cartridge, were reworked into games on future platforms, or were just straight up cancelled. The Nintendo 64 had a lot of interesting cancellations overall. Tons of third parties pledged their support, but eventually dropped out, obviously because of the limitations of the 64's cartridges. Contra Spirits, Ghosts and Goblins 64, Doom Absolution. There's not much that exists in the form of concrete images or videos of any of these, but they were being worked on at one point, which is about all there is to say. Quest 64 would have gotten a sequel if all hell broke loose, and Glover 2 was only cancelled because, well, the game was a big enough success to warrant a sequel. The publisher bought way too many cartridges of Glover 1, so they had like 150,000 of them laying around unsold. They didn't want to deal with more Glover. A Nintendo 64 version of Advance Wars and Fire Emblem were being worked on, but were either eventually scrapped in the case of 64 Wars, or reworked into a new game with Fire Emblem. But outside of the 64, there's Thrill Kill, a PS1 release that didn't. It was apparently so controversial, they just didn't want to deal with releasing it. It ended up getting leaked online and got passed around like crazy, and look at that, we're not all murderers with Thrill Kill out in the open, we're fine. A few Game Boy Color games never made it to market. South Park was originally going to appear, but was cancelled due to these two things just not making sense demographic-wise. Moving on to the 4th generation, and things are definitely slowing down. Not as many massive cancellations. Star Fox 2 would have been an obvious game to talk about, but Nintendo decided to finally release it in 2017 via the SNES Classic Edition. Who cares about it? But we might as well cover it. Obviously, the sequel to Star Fox, and it was cancelled simply because it was releasing in the latter half of the SNES's life. It would have looked puny and weak compared to the 3D consoles at the time, and the Nintendo 64 was coming out with a Star Fox game of its own in development. But whatever, this game wasn't cancelled. We're talking Kid Kirby today. Supposedly, it was going to use the SNES mouse and feature Kirby in his prime, an origin story. It was going to be developed by DMA Design. That's Rockstar Games, they worked on a Kirby game at one point. Dream was the basis for what would become Banjo-Kazooie, but the original game developed by Rare for the SNES and then the Nintendo 64, yeah, that was not this. An RPG in the style of the original Donkey Kong Country. This is pretty crazy as a Super Nintendo game looks-wise. It's a shame the original version of the game never saw the light of day. Now, I gotta talk about the Virtual Boy cancellations. Come on, Donkey Kong Country 2 was gonna be on this thing. That would have been terrible. GoldenEye 007 as a racing game. Alright, sure. VB Mario Land. It apparently would have played very similarly to standard Mario platformers, but it would have had wackier camera angles with an overhead shot being used once and Mario walking between the foreground and background. It would have been cool, but oh my god, this is slow. And finally, let's end things off with the 3rd generation of consoles. We could go over the 2nd and 1st generation, but what am I gonna talk about? Oh no, Dukes of Hazzard didn't come out on Atari, no! Earthbound, or Mother 1, or Earthbound Beginnings. The first Earthbound was intended to come out in North America, but never did, probably due to the cost of releasing an RPG on the NES near the release of the SNES, just wasn't worth it. Nintendo of America sat on a full English translation of the game for years until it finally released as Earthbound Beginnings on the Wii U Virtual Console. Donkey Kong's Fun with Music. This was a music educational title that taught everybody how fun music can be with Donkey Kong involved. It's actually pretty cool because Pauline is seen here as a vocalist, which she was in Mario Odyssey. Return of Donkey Kong was a game listed as a release in a few official Nintendo publications. It never surfaced, and we don't know what a game called Return of Donkey Kong would have looked like. If I had to guess, I'd say this might have been a temporary title for Donkey Kong Classics, which was a compilation of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. I don't know. SimCity was fully created for the NES, but just never released. Same goes for the California Raisins game and Sunman. Sunsoft was gonna make a Superman game, they lost the license, they went through the trouble to rename the game Sunman to just end up not releasing it, But none of these will ever compare Street Fighter on the NES. Yes. So those were just a few canceled games throughout history, but far from all of them. Who knows, like I said, maybe we can return to this topic eventually, or even take a look at specific canceled games themselves. But as of right now, I'm a little more concerned with maintaining my privacy. How does it look on me? If Guys DS can leak, who says my blood type and hair color can't? You know, might want to go a step further. Maybe a little more. Just a little more. Hey all, Scott here. In my spare time, I like to pit two entities picked at random against each other. Let's see what the first fighter is. Okay, it's gonna be myself, guilty as charged. Let's see who's next. Okay, Gizmondo widescreen. I already compare myself enough to that every day. What's the category we're fighting in? This isn't even Gizmondo widescreen's first win. The Wii U actually released. What did you do today? 250 games/babies are born every minute. They're both bustling industries. But because of how many games start development, it's fair to expect a good chunk of them to never reach completion. Game projects get canceled. It happens. They're such complicated pieces of media that sometimes things just end up failing to come together. But if games are so complicated, how complicated are the cartons you play them on? Listen, I'm not trying to downplay how difficult video games are to work on, but the video game consoles themselves, that's a whole different story. To successfully create a video game platform, a company has to talk to hundreds of other companies to see what they want out of gaming hardware, make deals, get games to come to the platform, get exclusive games in development, advertise the system itself alongside the games for it, create unique features, menu systems, all for a reasonable price. Developing a game system not only requires the creation of hardware, but fundamentally requires getting multiple other games in development, and because of that, yet not a lot of people make game systems as a hobby. I mean, EA could probably put out their own platform if they wanted to, but I have multiple questions, and they're all, why would they do that? There's a reason only 3 big console manufacturers exist now, and whenever somebody else tries to enter the ring, everybody can't stop laughing. It is incredibly risky to create a video game platform. With how much money has to get poured into not only creating the hardware, but funding exclusive game development, it's obvious why it's a 3-man game. But that's not to say others haven't tried or the big guys haven't attempted to launch other consoles with plans falling through. Canceled game consoles are some of the most elusive portions of video game history. I mean, even if a company is developing a console and things aren't going too hot, I mean, Jesus, man, you've already spent this much money. Just release it for kicks at that point. A game that's never seen the light of day. We're all pretty used to that. A game console itself, though, that's a bit more rare. Full platforms that were planned yet never saw the light of day, and what do you know, one of them happened to be Atari Game Brain. Oh yeah, of course, the Atari Game Brain. Can't have video games without the Atari Game Brain. The Game Brain was designed to play 10 of Atari's games at home. Pong, Super Pong, Ultra Pong, Video Pinball, the classics. This was in the era of the Pong console. Cheap little consoles you could buy that do one thing and one thing well. Play Pong. The Game Brain was a bit different though. It was sort of a Pong console, sort of a regular video game platform. See, it would have had cartridges and you could play different games by swapping out the cartridges. But it would only be able to play those 10 games. It wasn't designed to have a limitless library of titles. It was fundamentally a Pong console with a few variations of Pong you could select, but those variations would have been sold as separate cartridges to be... They decided against releasing the system because, I mean, the Atari 2600 was already out at that point. Who wanted this? Well, Atari was not one to shying away from releasing game consoles because around this time they were developing a handheld system, the Atari Cosmos. The big selling point of this thing was going to be its holographic display. It was 1981. From what I could gather, the Cosmos had only 9 games planned for it, and all of them were pretty much programmed into the system itself, kind of like the Game Brain. The cartridges you would use to activate the games contained the holograms, which I believe were pretty much those 3D looking pictures that move when you do. So one of the games was Asteroids. I believe you'd be playing Asteroids with a 3D looking picture in the background. Well, at least it wasn't the Intellivision 3. There's a reason these two things never came together. The Intellivision, Mattel's competitor to the Atari 2600, had a phone controller. It'll always have that against me. The Intellivision 2, Mattel's answer to fan demands for another Intellivision. It was a cheaper version of the Intellivision. I love their use of 2. But the Intellivision 3 was supposed to be a true successor, like a next-gen system. What the hell was the point of calling this one 2? But no, the Intellivision 3 wasn't the real next-gen system. That was going to be the Intellivision 4. Intellivision 3 was just to hold consumers over until that fateful day. I have specifically thought to myself, I will never legitimately say this, but Mattel lost their minds. Let's go back to Atari. You ever use the Atari 2600 and say, I wish it would sit on my lap? Well, they almost had you covered. The CX2500 and CX2000, these were to be budget versions of the 2600, but this time with the controllers on the console itself. Sure, I mean, I'm open to bullshit. There was going to be the Atari 2700, which was basically a version of the 2600 with built-in wireless controllers. You could buy a wireless adapter for the original system, but sadly this variant never saw the light of day. Then they worked on the Atari Mirai, which is famous for nothing. The system's purpose was never known. All we know is that somebody found the outer casing and it never released. That's it. Things would be truly different if the Atari Mirai actually released. For starters, I wouldn't be talking about it right now. But the Conix multi-system has one leg up on the Mirai. It has like this much more information out there. You could have gotten a chair with it. This system was supposed to be the most immersive thing on the planet. It had so many different controller configurations, force feedback, a chair you could have gotten with it. This was supposed to be the ultimate video game system. Half of this stuff seems like the fake kind of video game accessories you'd see people playing with in movies, but this was real life. Conix pretty much bit off more than they could chew with this thing. They crammed so much in here that it just wasn't feasible to release. The multi-system faded away, and the remnants of the project were purchased by Atari and eventually became the Atari Jaguar. Good. Speaking of the Jaguar, Atari was creating a system alongside it called the Panther. But this was scrapped to put more resources into the more powerful system. Listen, I love hotel rooms. You get free water bottles and bed bugs, but what I love most is when you have those hardwired video game controllers connected to the TV where you could play games for a small giant fee on your hotel bill. Well, what if there was a console that was like playing hotel games at home? The Taito Wow Wow Woo Woo was already copyrighted. It was going to play games off of CD, or for a small fee, you could download games via satellite. It's a hotel in the home. This was canceled probably due to budgetary reasons. At the time, it was a bit expensive cramming a CD-ROM drive and a satellite receiver into one console. Around the same time, Bandai was trying out their own CD-based game console, the Bandai HET, or HAT, or Home Entertainment Terminal. You guys know me, I love video game console names that sound like airports. So this was pretty much a Super Famicom with a CD drive and in the form of a laptop with various other features that I have no idea how they'd be used. It was portable and had a stylus for Super Famicom games. So why was Bandai making their own Super Famicom? Well, this isn't the most obscure thing out there. Various third-party companies have produced their own version of video game hardware with the permission of the original companies. But that's the thing, I don't think Nintendo wanted this. A Super Famicom you could use a stylus on. Yeah, you can also play it on the bus, I guess. And that brings us to one of the most well-known canceled game consoles of all time, or in this case, add-ons. Sega released the Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis. CDs were the future, after all. Nintendo looked at that and said, oh man, we need to f*** up too. They partnered with Sony to make the SNES CD, an add-on for the Super Nintendo that would be able to play games off of a CD. After Nintendo reread their contract with Sony, it was lame, so they partnered with Philips instead for this imaginary CD add-on that never came out. That's the excuse everybody gives when they're hiding something. The SNES CD add-on never came out, regardless of it being manufactured by Sony or Philips, but through the initial first partnership, Sony created their own version of the SNES with the CD add-on built in, the Nintendo PlayStation. Well, thank God Nintendo killed the deal with Sony. They definitely saved some money by not releasing a CD add-on and instead created their biggest competitor ever, who they've consistently lost to time and time again. At least it didn't make the Atari Jaguar Duo. Oh my God, Atari, piss out. Atari reigned supreme in terms of most unreleased shit. The Jaguar Duo was simply combining the Jaguar and Jaguar CD add-on to create something you didn't want to play. Now, Sega originally had plans to create a console in between the release of the Genesis, Sega CD, 32X, and the Sega Saturn. That would be called the Sega Neptune. This was to be a Sega Genesis with a 32X built in, a 32-bit cartridge-based console, not to be confused with the Sega Saturn, a 32-bit CD-based console, or the Sega Jupiter, another canceled 32-bit cartridge-based console, or the Sega Pluto, a canceled Sega Saturn with the Netlink adapter built in. I took an astronomy class once, this was all I took away from it. Around this general time was when Nintendo was working on a new handheld entitled Project Atlantis. It had a whole bunch of this in 1995. That wasn't gonna work. So they held off on the core concept until the Game Boy Advance in 2001. That's the thing, a lot of these canceled systems were just a bit too ahead of their time. That's comparable to the Panasonic M2 back in '96. It may have included DVD playback, and this Hasbro thing. It was canceled around the same time, this one focusing on VR. Like, come on, DVDs and VR in '96? Half of these systems were being made by companies who just couldn't do stuff like that. Cutting edge graphics. Hasbro. All these handhelds never came out because, yeah, I mean, handhelds may have been an easier investment than big boy home consoles, but Nintendo cornered the handheld market. Get out of here, Nano Gear. The Infinium Phantom, a console for playing PC titles. What? It was supposed to be released back in 2004 and would have been a digital-only console. You just downloaded the games. Yeah, it was fairly ahead of its time, and because of that, they kept delaying it until they lost all their money. Can you believe a company called Infinium wasn't trustworthy? But then we have the Panasonic Jungle. Yes, Panasonic has had quite the history of consoles, going from eek to yikes to what? The Jungle was going to be a handheld for playing MMOs. Good for them. Of course, I don't want to make fun of these consoles too much. They never came out. It's rude to mock things that never officially released. It's like making fun of a fetus.
Hey y'all, Scott here. I could certainly go for a definition right about now. Well, times 3. Localize, to make or become local. Well, at least one of us found our calling today, and if you excuse me, I'm going to be ordering a shipment of notebooks to localize for the Tucson, Arizona area so they can more clearly understand them. They just don't get it over there. I know, finally, someone's standing up for the people of Tucson, right?
Translation and localization, a Venn diagram's two best friends. There's so many similarities, but overall, they're definitely different. Translation is taking words and converting them from a different language, while localization is taking the general concept of something and adjusting it or even completely changing it for a different audience in a different part of the world. Translation and localization are not one, however, localization involves translation. Of course, in the video game industry, localization is a huge aspect of development and is many times overlooked. Sometimes localization is as simple as hitting the Go Translate button. This was definitely the case with games back in the 80s and early 90s. Old school RPGs and games with heavy amounts of text generally had very little effort put into the localization. Instead of rewriting a game's script to feel more at home for the new audience's area, it would basically be just a straight translation with multiple grammatical and spelling errors. But other times, especially nowadays, localization can be as daunting of a task as developing a whole new game. The script for the 3DS remake of Dragon Quest VII filled an entire bookshelf. Now that's a localization. The process generally starts during the development of the game nowadays. Originally, it would start after the game originally released. A team of translators and writers will receive updates and explanations from the developers of how certain scenes and characters are meant to be portrayed. Then the localization team will start to rewrite them to feel natural in the new language, while also keeping the spirit and main idea from the original. However, sometimes some things are just too darn exotic. Many elements from many games are different across the world based on cultural norms. What may be okay in one country is totally way not okay in another. Recently, with the aid of everybody's favorite, the internet, it's been blatantly obvious when something has changed from the original release. Nintendo of America has always been notorious for changing up elements of games for a Western release. Back in the 80s and 90s, they had a strict policy on the lack of violence, sexuality, and religion, but as Japan has different cultural norms, these policies led to editing and censoring localized versions of Japanese games. To this day, they are still very keen on stripping anything too sexy from their games. Of course, Japan is much more down for sexuality in media, so it makes sense sometimes to tone things down in westernized releases. The US version of Bravely Default made some outfits much less revealing and upped the age of minors in the game. Xenoblade Chronicles X totally let you customize boob size, but that was completely stripped out of the Western release. Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE had ages increased, more clothes added to some mega skin shots, and just some racy shots altered to be anti-racy shots. Fatal Frame Made in Blackwater featured unlockable costumes which allowed you to play in barely a costume, and this was just straight up removed and replaced with some Nintendo crossover outfits, as the game was published by Nintendo. These aren't anything that affect gameplay in any way, however, many players weren't too happy with the changes, bellowing censorship. I don't know, you see, a lot of these things don't make sense for the Western world, and just don't make sense in context of the game. Like, Fatal Frame is a horror game. Does it really make sense to play the game in anti-clothes? But to be fair, it was always supposed to be M-rated, leaving the costumes in a game intended not only for adults, but a rather niche audience wouldn't start riots in the street in my opinion. It's all about how these changes affect gameplay in my opinion, and in those examples, they don't. Those are all cosmetic and make more sense in terms of the Japanese market. However, sometimes pockets of gameplay are removed in localizations, in which Fire Emblem Fates had a few instances of this. Fates allowed you to pet the characters with the stylus coinciding with the relationship building mechanic in the game. Basically, pet the character, they'll like you better. This was completely gutted from the Western release due to the suggestive connotations. Also, the Japanese version of the game included a scene where a homosexual character is drugged and cured of said homosexuality, which may be considered as, say it with me now,
Gay conversion therapy!
Yep, that's gone from our stomping grounds. Yeah, it's unfortunate when entire pockets of gameplay are removed for international releases, but I mean,
gay conversion therapy!
Localized changes to games have been happening for years, and Earthbound Ness is naked here in Japan, but has the audacity to wear pajamas in North America. The arcade beat-em-up Final Fight featured the female character Poison as an enemy, but when making the transition to North America, Capcom didn't want people to get all up in arms about the player being up a woman, so instead of changing her sprite to some dude, they just said she was a dude. Huh. When Contra was being localized to Europe, they changed the title to Probotector and made human characters robotic due to potential conflict with the gunplay in the game. Many a times, blood in games is straight up removed or turned into some funk-riddled color. Zombies Ain't My Neighbors had the blood removed here in North America, yet Uncharted Drake's Fortune had the blood removed in Japan, and in PAL territories, Castlevania Bloodlines had the blood removed and the title changed to Castlevania The New Generation. The character Soda Pompinski in Punch-Out was originally named Vodka Drunkenski in Japan, oh boy. It's not just suggestive elements that are changed throughout regions. A lot of the time, translation just F's with the script and changes the meaning of certain aspects of the game. The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes was a light-hearted, don't-take-me-seriously multiplayer Zelda title for the 3DS. So the American localization team took that as an opportunity to cram internet memes into a Zelda game, while the European version feels much more Zelda-like in terms of the script. Final Fantasy X featured the characters Yuna tell Tidus, "I love you," while the Japanese version translated to a simple "thanks." Yeah, those two sayings don't necessarily mean the same thing. I've never played Final Fantasy X or X-2, and from what people say, it's not super weird, but when you take into consideration what the original intended that line to mean, it definitely leads to some solid discussion and analysis I have no right to get into. The Kirby games have a long history of changes while being localized. Not so much with the actual games themselves, but with the box art. Apparently Americans hate the concept of Kirby being a happy-go-lucky tuft of God knows what, so loads of Kirby box arts in North America give him some solid, angry eyebrows to imply that he's not just having fun, but having fun with some attitude. Sometimes localization is just too much for some games, and they're simply left to rot in Japan. The most famous example has been Mother 3, a part of the series we know as Earthbound. It was the final entry in the series and was originally in development for the Nintendo 64 DD, was cancelled, then resurrected as a Game Boy Advance game. Of course, it never made its way over here, which is unfortunate and also incredibly infuriating based on how much Mother 3 is referenced in games like Super Smash Bros. This has led to a dedicated group of fans to translate the game themselves, which is how most people outside of Japan have played it. Captain Rainbow was a Wii game developed by Skip, creators of Chibi Robo, and focused on a has-been superhero trying to regain his popularity and meeting up with a few Nintendo characters that time forgot. Now with Mother 3 and Captain Rainbow, these are two titles with a fair amount of text, and being such obscure niche games in the time of their release, localization just never happened. With Dead or Alive Extreme 3, that wasn't localized due to being too honkin' sexy. I can picture the American reviews as I speak. A spin-off of the fighting game franchise, Dead or Alive Extreme is a beach volleyball game, and when the third one released for PS4 and PS Vita, Koei Tecmo announced it would never make its way over stateside, but the PS4 and Vita are region-free, thank God. But this is why censorship generally happens. Cultural differences. It's not all about censorship and differences between cultural norms, however. Sometimes localization will change or remove something for different reasons or for no reason at all. One of the earliest examples of a game being changed drastically in the conversion from Japan to North America was Super Mario Bros. 2 on the NES, as it wasn't the Japanese version at all. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 was meant to be a game for those who mastered the original. It was incredibly similar to the first game, but with some jacked up difficulty. When Nintendo of America received the game, they noted it was too difficult and similar to the original. Thus, they took another game with some Mario-like elements, Doki Doki Panic, plopped some Mario sprites in, made a few extra changes, bada bing bada boom, the sequel to end all sequels. Of course, both the American version of Super Mario Bros. 2 made its way to Japan as Super Mario USA, and the Japanese version made its way over here as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. The Japanese version of The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures featured a mode only in that version called Navi Trackers. There's nothing specifically wrong with this mode, it's just only in the Japanese version. Of course, there's good localization, where the new interpretation houses the spirit of the original, but is now understandable to those in a different part of the world. And there's bad localization that could either be a sloppy quick translation or remove/change elements for no good reason. But it's incredibly interesting to see just what was lost in the process of localization. But it's odd to look at how some things are censored in one territory, but similar things aren't. Like, why is blood in games not okay in Japan, but okay sometimes? I mean, this is the same country that was home to the classic Famicom game Hitler's Resurrection Top Secret, a game about guess who's coming back, also known as Bionic Commando here.
I got in the notebooks I have to localize for Tucson, Arizona. Hopefully there's not much I have to change. Jesus!